Hi, I'm 𝗹cie𝘀𝗶𝗴, and today's webinar looks at how personal data is managed and whether we're in the midst of losing our identity. I'll also be going to the NUS Baba House to draw links between the features of the house and how personal data is contained. Ready or not? Let's go! NUS Baba House is managed by the NUS Museum and is a townhouse located at 157 Ning Road. This 3-story townhouse was built around 1895 and was acquired by NUS in 2006 with funds donated by Miss Agnes Tan in memory of her late father, businessman and community leader Tun Tan Cheng Lok. I'm here to meet Donald Lim, docent of the NUS Baba House.
So the first thing that you see when you enter the house is this pintu pagar here. So you notice the pintu pagar has got open fretwork, and this actually allows the family a certain degree of privacy and at the same time allowing for the circulation of air and light as well.
It suddenly feels very private in here.
Well, you may want to rethink that at the end of your tour.
Baba culture is a mixture of Chinese, Malay and European elements. If these different cultural elements from the past were compared to different types of personal data collected today, does its use shape our identities?
We think about data, and in particular this idea of potentially losing our identity. I think it's easy to get bound up in some of the hype around data, particularly in this so-called fourth industrial revolution. It's often said that data is the new oil, that it somehow is powering artificial intelligence. It's a really compelling metaphor. It sounds kind of intuitively sort of attractive, but it's completely wrong in almost every way. Because oil, you have to pay to extract it, you can only use it once, and there's a finite amount. Data, people give it to you for free, you can reuse it as often as you want, and it's essentially limitless. So this idea of data being the oil of the new economy I think is flawed, but it's clearly important. And it's kind of amazing that we aren't really even agreed on what it in fact is. Is data a right bound up with our notion of personal identity, for example? You can imagine that argument, and that's kind of how the Europeans tend to think of it, linking it with notions of personal dignity. Is it a property right? When Mark Zuckerberg was testifying before Congress, he said that individuals own all of their own content. Is data a bit like a kind of intellectual property right? Well, the fact that it's undefined, that we haven't really resolved this, really points to some of the complexities of the issues around this question. But another distinction that has to be made, however, is the difference between data protection and privacy. Because it's really striking that in many jurisdictions around the world, there have been arguments about privacy for centuries, and data protection only really came up in the last 40 or 50 years. Often the two terms are used as if they're interchangeable, but in fact there is an important distinction between them. And I can sort of spoil the punchline by telling you that in Singapore, there's no right to privacy, there is a right to a certain measure of protection of your personal data. So why is that? Well, privacy really is bound up with this idea of the ability to hold some of yourself back from the world, to protect a certain notion of family life, or to insulate yourself from the public gaze. And the origin of that right and the reasons and the ways in which it's been protected over the years has really been dominated by an intersection of threats, technology and culture. The threat, this notion of privacy really came up late 19th century America with the emergence of the camera. And suddenly the ability to take photographs meant you could be captured doing all sorts of things. What's the immediate protection against that? Well, some laws came up, but also just building a high wall was a method. Another threat that arose linked with technology was the microphone. When microphones started becoming used, a different notion of privacy became complicated. In the past, eavesdropping used to literally mean standing under the eaves, listening in on what someone was saying, but that became more tense with the arrival of the microphone, small devices. Jump forward to the 21st century, there is so much information about everyone available that you can easily imagine why people talk about privacy. The problem is, when you actually drill down into what is at stake, what they're worried about, it's not really privacy. Most people, when pressed, don't really want to insulate themselves from the public gaze. They don't want to keep a whole sphere of their life away from everyone else. What they want to do is control. They want to have some sort of ownership, some sort of agency in the way in which information about them is used in the world. I mean, you might, for example, understand that your phone probably knows more about you than your parents do, maybe even more than you do yourself. Do you want to take that information away from your phone? Some of you might, and increasingly phones are giving you that option. Most of you are more concerned about what the phone will do with that information and who it will share that information with and for what purposes. That's really where data protection comes in. Because where privacy used to mean the ability to sort of keep things to yourself, keep it away from the public, data protection is really about control. And this links in with the Personal Data Protection Act, which barely mentions the word privacy. And in case you think that's just a Singaporean thing, it's striking that the European General Data Protection Regulation also barely mentions the word privacy for all the reasons I've been highlighting. So what does the PDPA, this Personal Data Protection Act, require and what does it offer in terms of protection? The basic principles of personal data protection are that there should be restrictions on when personal data can be collected, used and disclosed. That you need a reason, a justification for collecting personal data, and usually you need some kind of consent for use and disclosure. So what does this actually mean in practice? Well, a good lawyer will tell you the first way to address a law, if you need to be in compliance with that law, is to work out whether it applies to you at all. So the Personal Data Protection Act, does it apply to NUS, for example? Well, if you go through the legislation, public agencies are exempted. NUS used to be part of the government. We're now independent. We're a company limited by guarantee. But it is striking, if you look through the schedules and the provisions of the Act, the polytechnics, IT, they're all exempted. So candidly, one of the first things I asked when the legislation was adopted was whether NUS should petition to be listed as a public agency, at least for the purposes of the Act. We quite rightly, I think, didn't go down that path. But that would be one way of avoiding being covered by the Act, because Singapore, unlike most other jurisdictions, limits its personal data protection to non-government entities like NUS. There is a separate provision of the Public Sector Governance Act, which does govern how the government uses data. A second way to get away from using from the Act applying is if the data in question is not personal data. So what does personal data mean? Well, it means data identifiable as linked to a particular person, either based on that data or other data that an organisation might reasonably have access to. So if it's properly anonymized data, for example, statistical information, it also doesn't apply. Of more relevance to NUS, there are certain situations in which there are exemptions, which mean that the Act does not require active consent, for example, for evaluative purposes. And that becomes important when NUS is actually using data. So how might all this apply to a university? Well, we start off with the question, when might we want access to data? How might we want to collect it, use it, disclose it? Looking at our educational mission in particular, you want to collect data when you're determining whether to admit a student, whether to give him or her financial aid. While a student is at NUS, you need to collect personal data, sometimes for assessment purposes, sometimes for disciplinary purposes, sometimes for enrichment purposes. In most of these situations, the safeguard, the bottom line of most data protection laws around the world is that you rely on consent. You get someone to say, yes, I agree that you can collect, use and disclose data for this purpose. That all sounds pretty good. And from a lawyer's perspective, it's a convenient way of organizing the agreement. The slight problem is, if I was doing this live, I'd ask you to literally put your hand up, but all of us on a regular basis are asked to agree to terms and conditions. If you have a phone, you're regularly asked to accept terms and conditions. Whenever you download an app, you're asked to accept terms and conditions. So put your hand up if you read all of those terms and conditions, in particular about personal data. So I've published books on personal data. I don't read them. It's a waste of time. You don't really have any chance to negotiate. If you want the service, you're going to have to agree. So why waste time reading thousands of words that some lawyer's been paid to write? This is a fundamental problem with data protection because it's premised on consent, this idea that we are all entering into contracts on a regular basis. That's obviously artificial, and so a recent roster of amendments that was brought into force in Singapore earlier this year shifts the ground slightly towards looking not at putting the onus on users to give their consent to the data that they own or that they possess being given over to an organization, and them being obliged to read and understand terms and conditions that they must agree to. What we're moving towards is an accountability regime where, at least in some circumstances, an organization, if there is a legitimate need to collect it, can collect data, provided they have a legitimate interest, provided they notify the person and have reasonable safeguards in place. So that's kind of where we're going. Let me round off at least the starting point by talking about some of the situations in which NUS might actually use data, when it would be appropriate, when it would be inappropriate, just to give you some illustrations. Can NUS collect data to determine whether to admit a student? Pretty clearly, yes. It would be frustrating to the entire mission of the university if we couldn't, and that's governed by the evaluation provision. Can we collect data to ensure that a student is who he or she says he or she is during an examination? Yes, clearly we can. That's also covered by the evaluative provisions. Can we collect data for disciplinary purposes? Yes, provided someone's still a student, there's provision for that. Can we provide data, can we share data in an emergency situation? A student's at risk. Can we use their mobile telephone number and give it to someone else? Yes, we can. If it's an emergency threatening the life, health or safety of that individual or other individuals. Can I draw upon personal data to stalk someone because I have a fascination with them? No, clearly not. That's clearly outside the scope of what the data was provided to NUS for. Can one of my colleagues use personal data to sell Tupperware to his or her students? No, that's clearly also outside the scope. So although the legislation is complicated, a lot of the use cases actually boil down to common sense. Would a reasonable person expect that the personal data that you want to collect, use and disclose is linked with the purpose that is meant to be providing a benefit to the user whose personal data is being collected, used or disclosed? And if the answer to that is yes, then 9 times out of 10, that'll give you your answer.
We are in a very exciting time of the Industrial Revolution. This 4th Industrial Revolution is about data transformation and at the same time artificial intelligence and automation. Previously, when we have database, they are all sorted separately. And now, with a click of a finger, device to device, machine to machine, we connect all these different databases together to form big data. And this big data match with our private information and create an opportunity for people to use those information. Of course, everything comes with a problem. And the problem in this case is privacy or privacy. This is important.
Wow, why is there such an open space in the middle of the house?
This is the air well and is situated in the family hall. This was where the family would carry out the day-to-day activities. And since sound travels up, anyone who is situated on the 2nd floor can actually eavesdrop on whatever is being said here and actually spy on whatever is being carried out here.
Oh, but that means with all these open windows, all sorts of information can be seen and heard.
That's right.
With the way social media has developed today, we have grown up in a very different era from the generations before, and for me, even the generation below me. I grew up in a period whereby social media was just starting up, where Facebook was still becoming a thing, Instagram was becoming a thing. But my sister grew up in a time where she was surrounded by devices, where Facebook and Instagram had already its own sort of corporate identity and function as social media. So when we think about identity, there's also many different layers on how we view these things. And I think what really makes that difference is this question of authenticity of identity. A lot of times we ask whether our online personas are the same as the people that we are right now. I would say that as we have progressed in the past few years, what I've observed is that the online persona has become less and less of a shield for ourselves, but also another image that we choose and actively portray to the world to be able to connect with other parts of the world itself. I mean, for example, when I was first a young, small child trying to get into all this social media, we had all these kinds of fake names on Facebook. We had blogs that had fake pictures, that had different kinds of aesthetics. But increasingly, as social media has become more and more mainstream, there's always this push and this desire for authenticity. You can see it even on YouTube, where you have people where there's backlash against people who are not seen to be their real selves. And as the more manufactured a persona gets, the less popular they are. And even now, we can see, even for politicians, they're all hopping onto social media to create this authentic brand of themselves, to showcase to people that they understand others, that they are part of the larger community. And I feel that that's what really is all this sharing of information is about, that we all have this desire to connect to other people. In the past, these conversations happened face to face. It happened in real life. Perhaps it happened through Telegram, it happened through the telephone, but we didn't have a big organizational intermediary to facilitate all these conversations. And where we have come now in social media is that everybody is a participant in the creation of this social media, and therefore also they have the ability to create their own identity. So with that, they share their personal information in order to create their personal identity. And that's why I feel that when youth look at personal data, sharing it comes across as something that's very natural to them, because it is something that they have always been used to. It's something that's part of themselves, to give away this kind of information for themselves and to seek the same from others around them.
I think it's certainly true that our notion of identity has changed. I mentioned earlier that notions of privacy have changed, that if you look at the history of privacy, the people who were writing about privacy in the 1960s were tearing their hair out at the idea that the government would have a file on an individual. And there are people writing books in the 1970s, Weston among others, saying that the very fact that information about you is collected, that it is stored on a piece of paper or in a database, that will have a chilling effect. It will transform the way in which we think about our interactions with the world. I think it's telling if you jump forward a couple of decades, in the 1990s, as some of these fears began to be realized, there were two major books with Big Brother in the title, both about the emergence of the surveillance state. But if you go one decade forward to the 2000s, to the noughties, there are also two significant books with Big Brother in the title, both about the reality TV program. And this really points to a challenge for those of us who study privacy, data protection, which is that there is this huge disjunction between what people say and what they do. People say they really care about privacy. People will sign petitions, they'll write letters to Mark Zuckerberg, and then they'll go back to sharing information about themselves in a way that suggests they can't be serious in caring about privacy. So in all of this, what happens to identity? Well, I think identity really is changing. And I wouldn't say we're losing it, but I think identity is really changing its meaning. Because identity used to mean the thing that distinguished you, that separated you from everyone else, that made you unique. These days, I think there are very few people who think that way. I think they regard identity as something that connects them with the world. They look for points of connection, they share information about themselves, they often construct an online identity that may be somewhat distinct, better, sometimes worse, than the one that they might have embraced before the digital age. So no, I wouldn't say we're losing identity, but I think identity really has changed its meaning. Is that a good thing? I think that is a really important question. And all of the work that's been done on surveillance capitalism, on the attention economy, on the extent to which young people in particular are often more comfortable interacting online than in person, that I think is a really important question to study. And I think the pandemic has exacerbated some of these tensions, with some of our students saying, and indeed some of our faculty saying, they prefer to just continue interacting online indefinitely. I don't agree with that. Certainly from the perspective of a law school, and I would say from the perspective of just being a good human being, human existence has to be social. It has to be about interacting in person, identities interacting in physical life, in real life. Otherwise, artificial intelligence can become artificial life.
Now this is the altar to the kitchen god, and the kitchen god's main duty is to spy on whatever is going on in this house. And a few days before Chinese New Year, he will ascend to heaven and give his report to the Jade Emperor. And based on his report, the Jade Emperor will then decide whether or not to bless this family in the coming year.
Oh, that means the information in this house is going beyond even our realm.
You are so right.
Data ethics is one of the most important part of ISO 27701, which is actually for enhancing data security and privacy. Importantly, what it says is, let's get back to basic. And by that is, how can we make all these different regulations harmonized? How can we make it simple? So it goes back to one basic principle, which is the golden rule. How you treat others depends on how you want to be treated. And how you want to treat others' personal data depends on what you want your own personal data to be treated. People who handle personal data, manage the data, and at the same time use the data should be mindful. And what should they be mindful about? Every one of us have an ability to reflect and to think. And we can tap into our own conscious to be fair to the person, and at the same time make sure we respect the person. And with that comes a very important term that I coined, which is called personal data mindfulness. One of the most important parts of personal data mindfulness is at the point of collection. From the person who collects data, the person must be clear as to what exact data is relevant, and never to over-collect information that is not required.
As a student leader, what I personally feel is that we are very comfortable with giving out our personal data because we are so used to it. But we are less comfortable, less familiar with how to protect ourselves from anything bad that happens. And even more so, we are less familiar with the duty to be able to protect other personal data that we receive from others, because we are so used to already receiving them beforehand.
I've heard that there are peepholes in houses like this. Is that true?
That's a very good question. Let me show you an example.
Sure.
So this peephole overlooks the front door. And the purpose of this is to protect the family from any kind of unwanted attention and safeguard the family's privacy.
In the life cycle of personal data, it is an end-to-end process. From the point of collection, whether that collection comes with a permission or a consent, that is very important. If you deceive the person into collecting data without the permission, I think it is very difficult to justify that form of stealing the data. Then follows from storing the data. Where do you store the data? How do you store the data? Are they stored in a secure manner so that nobody can access the data? At the same time, very importantly, is how people use the data. What did you use the data for? Was this use an approved use with informed consent? Or is this a new use that you have imagined that you want to take? Very importantly, at the end of the day, is about how you dispose those data after you have used them.
So we are now in the antechamber before we enter the bridal chamber proper. Now you actually see a pair of chairs down here, and it is said that on the wedding night, when the bride and groom are comfortably settled within the bridal chamber, the matriarch of the family would sit here, and then she would eavesdrop on what was going on inside the bridal chamber.
Aren't matters like this a little confidential?
Well, you know.
Data ethics is a set of principles, a set of ethical principles that challenge the person on what they should do when they handle personal data. Data ethics, formulated in a systematic manner, can be an enterprise data ethics framework where a company or enterprise or an organization or institution have a set of systematic principles to follow so that researchers, data handlers, data managers, and data users actually can follow easily without going through the tons of laws and multiple guidelines.
I think when we talk about personal data and how easily we share it, it's really a matter of how much we also value that data. Sometimes we give it out away very easily without a second thought. And all these laws actually come to help to remind us again that the things that we're giving out, do we need to give it out for free? Do we need to give it out just for a service that we want to use to be able to connect with other people? Is it, a lot of questions are coming out, is it right for us to give out so much information about ourselves in exchange for something that may not actually be worth it? And what we need to perhaps recalibrate is this value judgment of the value of personal data. As youths, we don't really think that much about the exact value of the personal data that we give out as compared to perhaps my parents would say, oh, why would you even create a Facebook profile, right? Why would you give somebody more leverage, more information about you? But at the same time, giving people information is not necessarily giving away a piece of myself. It's not giving away a piece of property, which is why I don't think when I give out personal data, it's losing a piece of myself, but also an active choice to share it in return for other things. What we need to look at is who are we sharing these things to? What is the purposes for? And to what extent, how much are we sharing all of these information to? And how much do we individually value it? Sometimes we don't think too much about it because these are information that we know about ourselves and it just comes naturally to us to give it to others. But sometimes it will also be good for us to sit down and think about what about these data is important to us, is meaningful to us, and exactly who do we need to, who can we really trust them with. And when we talk about protection of personal data, it is all the more important because we are looking so much at the benefits of giving out all this information. We want to be able to connect with the world, but then again, we will always have the big bad wolf in the corner who is ready to take advantage of it. And that's where the protection must come in. As a student leader, what I personally feel is that we are very comfortable with giving out our personal data because we are so used to it. But we are less comfortable, less familiar with how to protect ourselves from anything bad that happens. And even more so, we are less familiar with the duty to be able to protect other personal data that we receive from others because we are so used to already receiving them beforehand. And so that's why I think it's necessary for us to have these kinds of conversations with student leaders, with students, to be able to understand how to better implement processes in order to protect all kinds of students and to ensure that we are able to carry out our processes, our activities to bring people together, but also have certain safeguards to make sure that all the personal data is in place.
What is this small space about?
Now this space is deliberately kept dark so that anyone who wants to listen to whatever is going on in the room next door can actually sit here unobserved.
Thank you for shedding some light on this.
You're welcome.
Technology changes, and that's good for mankind. Problems and issues will come out anytime. Laws have to play catching up. But ethical principles should not change. Being honest, respecting the data subject, first do no harm, the golden rule, such principles has been there since mankind begins.
We have this regime that's premised on user autonomy, that users have some measure of control of their data, although we're slowly moving towards a more accountability-based regime. And so the onus, as if you're looking at this and thinking, I'm a user of NUS data, the onus should really be on you to work out, do I really need to collect, do I really need to use, and do I really need to transfer or disclose this data? And if the answer to those questions is no, the very simple solution is don't collect the data. And this is, I think, increasingly becoming a tension between AI and actual uses of personal data. Because AI, as most people are kind of aware, at least vaguely, AI depends on data. And so if your perspective is trying to build a good AI model, then really what you don't want to do is collect everything. The more data, the better. There's an old saying from Silicon Valley, whoever has the most data wins. But I think increasingly users are wary of organizations that adopt that approach. And so although it might be good for the AI model, it's very bad for your relations with users. And so what users want is this idea of reasonableness. And to me, the simplest way of explaining this is just imagine all the information goes public and you're having a candid conversation with a student, an employee, an external stakeholder, and they ask you the question, why did you collect? Why did you use? Why did you disclose this data? And if you can't answer any of those questions, you've got a problem.
Are we losing our identity by giving away our personal data? My view is no. We give our personal information away as a means to share more and create our own identity, as a means to build our identity in the online world and in the offline world nowadays. And that's what, and by being even more active, being more intentional about the things that we share, and being aware of what we are sharing, not just to people around us, but to organizations, businesses, governments. By knowing all this information that we are sharing, we are also being aware of the identity that we are constructing for ourselves. So I think giving away personal data doesn't actually mean that you are losing your personal self, but actually becoming more aware and more intentional about the identity that we are making.
Thank you for showing me around this wonderful house.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you very much for visiting us today. So how did you find your visit? Did it give you any ideas about personal data protection?
Well, I guess I prefer my personal data to stay personal.